Joffrey Baratheon was but a boy when he first laid claim to the Iron Throne. Yet he possessed a flame in his veins that could scald the winter snows as well as spark terror in the eyes of his enemies. In this alternative future, where his grip did not falter and fate did not intervene to curtail his youth, he would not only hold the throne. He would mold it to his will for half a century. The morning after his victory in the War of the Five Kings, all of King's Landing stirred with a trembling expectation. Soldiers in golden cloaks patrolled the streets, battered but triumphant, while banners bearing the stag and lion sigil rippled in the wind as though they themselves took pride in his ascent. Whispers abounded as the people wondered if the new king would be as ruthless as rumored. Some swore he would empty their larders to feed his own lust for power, while others hoped he would deliver them from chaos into an era of stability. Joffrey, striding through the Red Keep, felt the hush of the corridors greeting him, and with every step, his spine braced with an ever-growing confidence. The throne was his no matter the cost. He reveled in that knowledge. Yet beyond the proud tilt of his chin, those closest to him could see a flicker of something else in his eyes, an energy that was too large for any boy to contain. It was ambition coiled tight, an unrelenting desire to be recognized and feared. He did not earn this triumph easily. The Lannister gold and Tywin's unyielding strategies had paved his way, but Joffrey, spiteful, daring Joffrey, had pressed the advantage when others would have hesitated. He had learned ruthlessness from Cersei, though even she sometimes looked on him with apprehension. And yet, in the final days of the war, a strange alchemy had taken hold of the king. Where once he had delighted in cruelty for its own sake, he began to see the fleeting value of fear alone. He observed how men followed those who gave them a purpose beyond cowering in the dark. Cersei, always pragmatic, had taught him that fear was a potent weapon. But young Joffrey, confronted with the complexities of a kingdom fractured by civil war, recognized he might need more than a sword and a snarl. There needed to be order, a system that rewarded those loyal to him and punished his foes in a way that bolstered his rule. Nevertheless, his craving for recognition did not vanish overnight. On the day after his official coronation, a grand affair held in the Great September of Baelor, he paraded through the city upon a magnificent black stallion. The streets were lined with small folk who cheered perhaps more from exhaustion than genuine devotion, relieved to see the endless bloodshed receding. Joffrey felt their voices as a throbbing hum in his chest. He lifted his hand in perfunctory waves, as if reminding them that the War of the Five Kings had ended in his favor, and they owed him everything. This was his city now, and if they did not love him yet, they would learn. Within the Red Keep, courtiers and sycophants abound. Even the Tyrells had reappeared, albeit in a weakened capacity after the war. Margaery Tyrell approached Joffrey with a delicate courtesy that, despite his youth, awakened in him the sense of being something more than he was before. Gone were the days when his mother directed each moment of his life. Though still under Cersei's watchful eye, Joffrey had stepped into a realm of sovereignty that no one, neither his mother nor his grandfather, could fully deny. Tywin tried to direct him through practiced mentorship, but the older man soon discovered that victory had inflated the young king's sense of self in ways that no stern guidance could fully contain. Yet Joffrey had learned enough from his grandfather to avoid outright foolishness. He understood that to maintain the crown, one needed cunning as well as steel. No sooner had the blood-drenched victory settled than new challenges emerged. While Stannis had been driven back to Dragonstone and Robb Stark's rebellion quashed in the north, scattered pockets of resistance flared. Rumors traveled of pockets of northern rebels refusing to bow to the Iron Throne. Many expected Joffrey's first move would be to unleash the full might of the crown upon these survivors. But the newly minted king did something unexpected. Instead of immediate annihilation, he opened negotiations. His advisors were astonished, whispering that the boy who used to torment Sansa Stark for sport could not possibly be the same young monarch who dared to parley with the battered North. Yet Joffrey commanded that ravens be sent with the promise that the North would be allowed a degree of autonomy in governing itself so long as it acknowledged his supremacy. It was a gambit, a cunning step. If the proposal was accepted, the North might finally yield and grant him the peaceful reign he needed to secure his position in the South. If it was refused, Joffrey would have proven he had attempted diplomacy, and then he could march north under the pretense of a just cause. The royal council was divided. Some were hungry to punish the traitors brutally, but Joffrey allowed them to grumble while he waited. A part of him still thirsted for vengeance against the Starks, but he had learned from Tywin that retribution was most effective when tempered by strategy. In the quiet of his private chambers, he caught a glimpse of himself in the polished steel mirror. He saw a boy no longer. He straightened his shoulders, recalling the roars of approval at his coronation, the hush of fear from his enemies, and the acceptance he so desperately wanted. He told himself he would be the greatest king the Seven Kingdoms had ever known, or he would burn it all to the ground trying. Installment 2. They answered his ravens, though not all at once. Some northern lords agreed to bend the knee in exchange for the promise of leniency, autonomy in certain northern affairs, and a respectful handling of the captives who had once risen against him. Joffrey found the negotiations tedious, but he was cunning enough to let his council handle the details while he gleaned the broad strokes. To maintain stability, he married Margaery Tyrell, forging a crucial alliance. It was a strategic move. The Tyrells, though weakened, still commanded valuable farmlands and wealth that could ensure the capital did not starve. Also, Margaery's knack for public relations, gifted in winning the love of the small folk, could help polish Joffrey's tarnished image. The wedding was lavish, though less so than it might have been before the war left the crown with significant debts. The great September glistened with candlelight, the septas chanting solemn hymns as Joffrey and Margaery exchanged their vows. Outside, golden banners intertwined with rose garlands. The king wore armor beneath his regal finery, a subtle statement that he was still prepared for war if needed. Margaery glided at his side, offering encouraging smiles that seemed genuine enough. Though she hardly knew Joffrey's deeper nature, she recognized an ambition in him, and she was determined to harness it. A grand feast followed, and the lords of Westeros who had survived the war attended with equal parts celebration and caution. Many had lost sons, brothers, and fathers in the conflict, and the sight of Joffrey on the throne evoked mixed feelings. He was the victor, yes, but he was also the boy king whose temper was infamous. However, that evening, Joffrey was on his best behavior. He toasted his guests, recognized the hardships the realm had endured, and pledged himself to the prosperity of the Seven Kingdoms. While some found it difficult to reconcile this polished courtesy with the cruel prince they remembered, others dared to hope that the trials of the war had forged a wiser monarch. He was still young, with a temper simmering behind his sea-green eyes, but the tension in his jaw spoke of restraint. The next morning, Joffrey sat in the small council chamber, flanked by Margaery, who observed quietly. Tywin Lannister, newly named Hand of the King, read out the letters from the northern lords who had bent the knee. Each had penned their pledges of loyalty. Yet there were others, rumors of rogues who moved in the Wolfswood, refusing to give up the memory of Robb Stark. Some whispered that a surviving Stark might be out there, hidden from the crown. Sansa, of course, still remained at court, a thorny presence that reminded him daily of the North's resilience. But he kept her there as a hostage all the same. He did not torment her as he once did, for if the war had taught him anything, it was that a hostage was more valuable unbroken. He might need her again, if only to force the North's hand. Joffrey listened to the council's chatter about the rebellious pockets. Certain lords urged a ruthless crackdown, others advised caution, fearing new rebellions might ignite if they went too far. The king himself waited until the debate fizzled, then pronounced his decision. The North would have 1 year of official peace, during which any further uprisings would be crushed mercilessly. Until that time, they would remain under watch. And to further demonstrate his magnanimity, he declared taxes on the North would be somewhat reduced in recognition of the hardships they had suffered. The council was stunned. Lower taxes were not a notion typically aligned with Joffrey's reputation for cruelty. Tywin studied his grandson's face, suspicious of the boy's motives, but said nothing. In truth, Joffrey had begun to sense that ruling was less about satisfying his immediate whims than it was about orchestrating a broader tapestry of power. The applause of the small folk, the relief of the lords, these were pieces on his game board. With each act of mercy, he could keep the rebellious corners subdued, or at least uncertain. And so it went. The realm, bruised and wearied, tried to heal under his watch. Taverns reopened, trade routes buzzed with cautious optimism, and blacksmiths turned from forging swords to shaping plowshares, albeit only in part, for Joffrey was not naive. He maintained a standing army larger than his predecessors thought feasible, funneling crown funds into ensuring the capital's security. The gold cloaks were reorganized, promotions given to those who had proven loyalty on the battlefield. Over time, the people saw more men patrolling the streets who displayed a certain discipline. They carried themselves with the knowledge that King Joffrey was not to be trifled with, but also that he recognized fidelity. He rewarded competence. Those who served him well found themselves rising through the ranks, earning enough pay to feed their families. Small gestures, but significant in a realm still recovering from war. The seasons turned, and with the approach of autumn, it was not only the leaves that changed. A subtle shift in the king himself became noticeable. His outbursts of anger, once so frequent, had lessened. In public, at least, he kept them well concealed. Margaery played her part too, hosting charitable events to feed the war-orphaned children, urging Joffrey to attend some of these functions. He would watch the little ones line up for bread, some of them missing limbs or bearing scars, and a flicker of recognition would cross his features. Perhaps he was reminded of how easily his own life could have ended during those chaotic battles. Or maybe he simply realized that controlling the narrative of his benevolence was more powerful than indulging cruelty. In either case, he came off more regal, more self-possessed. The first real test of his rule came sooner than expected. Highgarden, now overshadowed by King's Landing in political power, requested royal assistance with a band of raiders on the Reach's southern border. Ordinarily, the Tyrells would have crushed such a threat themselves, but post-war ravages had left them weaker. Lords of the Dornish marches were hesitant to send troops, suspecting it was some ploy of the Tyrells to rearm. So the plea reached the royal court, and many waited to see how Joffrey would respond. After all, if he truly reigned as king of the Seven Kingdoms, this was his moment to prove it. He decided to dispatch a sizable contingent led by capable knights loyal to the crown. Yet he did not strip them entirely from the capital, wary of leaving himself vulnerable. Instead, he coordinated with various lesser lords who had bent the knee, granting them a chance to prove their loyalty in open combat. The result was a swift, brutal campaign that scattered the raiders and restored peace to the farmlands. Word of the crown's intervention spread throughout the Reach, earning Joffrey a glimmer of respect. It was said that the king had saved them not from altruism alone, but from the pragmatic understanding that a hungry, raider-plagued region would yield fewer taxes for his treasury. Still, results were results, and farmland was spared. In the following weeks, Margaery urged him to tour the newly secured territories to reinforce his image as a protector. Joffrey agreed, loading the royal procession with guards and supplies. Along the way, they passed villages that had once flown banners for Renly Baratheon or had quietly supported the Tyrell-Lion alliance. Now they lined the roads to watch their king. Joffrey rode at the head, golden crown catching the sunlight. He made sure to speak to local elders, giving them token assurances that the realm would not forget them. Behind his stern composure, though, he was exulting in their gazes. He had earned this. They looked up at him not merely out of fear, but also out of a cautious hope. That was new, and it tasted sweet. Installment 3. As the first year of Joffrey's reign drew to a close, the capital began to feel a renewed sense of structure. Whether out of fear or grudging respect, fewer voices openly challenged him. Tywin Lannister, satisfied that the boy was beginning to understand the game, managed some semblance of pride behind his characteristic coolness. Littlefinger, cunning as ever, still moved about with murmured deals, forging new trade treaties that filled both the crown's coffers and his own pockets. Varys watched carefully, a slight smile creasing his lips at times, as if the spider could sense the subtle transformation in the king's nature. Having established a precarious peace, Joffrey now turned his attention to the seats of power in Westeros. The Tullus, with Edmure as the new Lord of Riverrun, had bent the knee, albeit uneasily. House Bolton had taken over the north in the wake of the Starks' downfall, but their loyalty was as questionable as their methods were notorious. Still, Joffrey had little desire to see more blood spilled in that icy terrain, at least not yet. He kept a watchful eye on the north while focusing on stronger ties with the Stormlands. The Baratheon seat that had come under his banner once Stannis was exiled to Dragonstone. Though some Storm Lords were bitter at having served under Renly or Stannis, they recognized the strategic advantage of aligning with the king, especially when Joffrey offered them better trade opportunities and tax exemptions. It was in the second year of his reign that Joffrey encountered a personal challenge he had never anticipated. Margaery Tyrell, ever vibrant, decided it was time to produce an heir for the realm. Joffrey, who had only begun to taste the fruits of unrestricted power, was at first indifferent to fatherhood. But Margaery insisted, gently at first, then with firmer conviction, that he must secure the succession if he truly wanted to stabilize his line. The boy king bristled at the notion of being told what to do, yet something in him recognized the truth. A king without an heir was a king with an insecure future. He could not allow that. So he acquiesced, if only because the realm, and especially Tywin, would demand it. The months that followed were a lesson in humility. Joffrey, used to commanding men at sore point, found himself increasingly aware that there were forces beyond his control. Marjorie's womb was one such force. When the first pregnancy ended in a miscarriage, he found himself uncharacteristically shaken. The potential of a Baratheon heir had seemed like a mere formality, yet now he felt the sting of uncertainty. How the realm whispered. Some said the king's blood was cursed, others attributed it to stress. Yet Joffrey refused to appear weak. He visited Marjorie in her chambers, eyes steely but voice subdued, telling her they would try again. Perhaps it was the first time he realized that fear alone could not bend nature to his will. Even so, a hush of sympathy rippled through King's Landing. Marjorie, with her gift for public relations, received an outpouring of support. Joffrey, whenever he ventured out, was greeted with well wishes by the small folk. Though he had not consciously sought it, he began to experience a kind of empathy from his subjects, albeit a hesitant one. Those who had lost children in the war or to illness understood that heartbreak could touch even the highest. While Joffrey did not openly show sadness, the slight dimming of his usual swagger told the people enough. For a moment, they saw a king who was human, not merely a tyrant. This subtle shift fed the legend that perhaps Joffrey had changed. Meanwhile, the North continued to bristle. Roose Bolton sent formal letters pledging fealty but also demanded additional funds to rebuild Winterfell, claiming it was in the crown's interest to have a stable stronghold in the north. The king mulled over the request. On one hand, giving the Boltons too much autonomy seemed risky. On the other, refusing might spur renewed rebellion. Ultimately, he sent a modest sum, enough to show he was not ignoring them, but not so much as to cede undue power. Each diplomatic maneuver was a lesson, each allocation of resources a test of his new approach. Tywin, watching from the sidelines, occasionally intervened with advice, but more often he allowed his grandson to learn by trial. As the weeks turned into months, the king's focus drifted southward. Dorne, which had largely remained aloof during the War of the Five Kings, showed signs of stirring. Prince Doran Martell was ill, and rumors suggested his fiery heir, Prince Trystane, might be forging alliances with Essos traitors. Joffrey studied reports from his spies. If the Dornish decided to press for independence, or worse, if they decided to avenge Elia Martell's death through some covert plot, King's Landing could be in jeopardy. So Joffrey invited ambassadors from Dorne to the capital, offering them preferential trade rights through the port of Old Town if they would reaffirm their loyalty to the Iron Throne. The negotiations were delicate. The Dornish possessed a proud sense of self-rule, and they remembered how badly they had been wronged by the Lannisters in the past. Still, gold and opportunity spoke loudly, and soon enough, a contingent of Dornish ambassadors arrived, greeted by Joffrey's personally selected knights. He was determined to impress them with splendor and a carefully measured courtesy. At a feast held in their honor, the king extended a welcome that was almost jarring in its warmth, especially coming from him. The Dornishmen, draped in bright silks, watched him with cool, discerning eyes. Yet Joffrey, guided by Marjorie's gentle urgings, played the role of the gracious monarch. He toasted their shared future, extolled the virtues of Dornish wine, and listened with an air of politeness as they recounted their grievances. Indeed, the memory of Oberyn Martell's death at the hands of the crown's champion was still fresh in their minds. Joffrey recognized that bridging this gap would require more than just words. He had something else to offer, a prospective marriage alliance. A younger cousin his, the child of one of the lesser-known Lannister branches, could be wed to a Martell, symbolizing renewed friendship. The notion was tentatively accepted, pending further negotiation. All the while, Joffrey remained vigilant. His scouts had reported a cluster of Sellswords in the Stormlands, men who claimed to have fought for Stannis once. Rather than resort to immediate violence, Joffrey dispatched loyal bannermen to either recruit or expel them, hoping to prevent another rebellion. As he laid these snares of diplomacy and strategy, he felt a surge of pride. This was power of a different stripe. Not the blatant cruelty of an angry child, but the cunning dominance of a true king. If these efforts succeeded, soon no one in the Seven Kingdoms would be able to deny that Joffrey Baratheon was not just a tyrant, but a monarch capable of forging peace in his own unyielding way. Installment 4. The next great crisis struck in the capital itself. A plague of suspicious origin began to spread among the slums of Flea Bottom. Within days, hundreds of small folk took ill, many dying with blackened tongues and feverish eyes. Panic flared through the winding alleyways, and the unwashed masses poured toward the Red Keep, seeking any form of assistance. When the Gold Cloaks attempted to force them back, the crowd nearly rioted. Joffrey had always harbored little affection for the impoverished masses. He remembered with distaste how they had once hurled dung at him. But he could see the danger in letting the illness spiral out of control. Not only could it breach the castle walls, it could also undermine the fragile peace he was building. Summoning Grand Maester Pycelle, Joffrey demanded an immediate plan. Pycelle trembled, his long beard shaking, and offered a few antiquated methods, quarantining afflicted districts and burning the bodies before the sickness could spread. Joffrey found the idea crude but perhaps necessary. He ordered the city watch to seal off Flea Bottom's worst streets, instructing them to provide food and rudimentary care to those trapped inside. At the same time, he commanded the maesters to work tirelessly on a remedy, any potion or concoction that might alleviate the symptoms. Margaery, as always, suggested a softer approach. She lobbied for an official royal presence among the afflicted, at least to distribute bread or medicine in a show of compassion. Joffrey grimaced at the thought of exposing himself to disease, but he understood the value in her plan. So he sent Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers, with a squad of gold cloaks to oversee relief operations. While Joffrey himself remained safely within the castle, he publicly praised Loras's bravery, spinning it as a gesture of royal benevolence. The plague, horrifying as it was, offered an opportunity to project an image of concern for his people. Over the next fortnight, the quarantine measures managed to contain the spread. Thousands still died, but the entire city was spared a worse fate. Loras's presence in the afflicted neighborhoods became the talk of King's Landing. The handsome knight, well-liked by the small folk, reassured them that the crown had not abandoned them. And though Joffrey did not walk those streets himself, he orchestrated supply wagons and posted healers at each gate, thereby mitigating further chaos. Eventually, the outbreak lessened and the king declared a day of mourning for those lost. Cynics claimed he only did so to salvage whatever goodwill he could, but many were surprised by the solemn sincerity of the ceremony. Bells tolled throughout the city, and Joffrey stood upon a balcony overlooking the masses, observing a moment of silence. In that hush, for the first time, a palpable unity could be felt between the throne and the street. Tales of this plague and the king's response reached beyond the city walls, carried by travelers and merchants. In taverns across Westeros, the name Joffrey Baratheon no longer evoked only terror, it also came with the acknowledgement that he was keeping the peace, however tenuous. Some said he was mellowing with responsibility. Others insisted it was still a facade, that the real Joffrey simmered beneath the surface, ready to lash out at the slightest provocation. But for now, the realm breathed a collective sigh of relief. This relative calm allowed Joffrey to turn his attention to a task he had postponed for too long, reckoning with the remnants of the Stark and Baratheon lines. Stannis remained holed up on Dragonstone, occasionally issuing defiant proclamations that he was the rightful king. Most of Westeros ignored him now, recognizing that he had neither the men nor the resources to mount another serious campaign. The north was more complicated. Rumors persisted of a feral boy leading small guerrilla strikes against Bolton forces near the Wolfswood, some even daring to say it was Rickon Stark returned from the dead. That was almost certainly rumor, Joffrey told himself, but he could not let it fester. And so, with cold calculation, he invited Roose Bolton to King's Landing to discuss the matter. The Lord of the Dread Fort arrived in secret, escorted by his sinister bastard son, Ramsay. Their presence put the court on edge. Even Joffrey, who prided himself on his intimidation, felt a strange chill in their company. Bolton's voice was a low monotone that contrasted with Ramsay's unsettling smirk. In the privacy of the small council chamber, they laid out the situation: pockets of resistance in the north, scattered forces loyal to the old Stark line, and intangible rumors about a hidden heir. Joffrey's face remained inscrutable as he listened. Rather than immediately advocate for more violence, he asked if the Boltons could handle this themselves. Ramsay's grin widened, promising to bring flayed corpses of rebels to the king. But Joffrey, surprisingly, held up a hand. "Curb your excess," he said, voice tight. "If there's a hidden Stark, I want them delivered alive. I won't have the North rising up under a martyr's banner." A flicker of disappointment crossed Ramsay's face, and Roose Bolton inclined his head carefully. "As you command, your grace." That night, Joffrey could not quite shake the conversation. Once, he might have relished the thought of the Boltons wreaking havoc in his name. Yet, as he stared into the darkness of his bedchamber, he felt uneasy. He knew that excessive cruelty, especially at the hands of men like Ramsay, could backfire. The North was not fully subdued. If they rallied around some half-mythical Stark child, the crown could be drawn into another endless war. Best to keep matters contained, to rule with the careful mixture of fear and incentive that had served him so far. His reflections were interrupted when Margaery entered. her face illuminated by a single candle. She told him she had news. She was with child again. The possibility struck him like thunder. A swirl of emotions gripped him. Excitement, fear, triumph, and something close to vulnerability. Almost reflexively, his hand drifted to the lion-headed pommel of the dagger at his bedside. He recalled how once, as a younger man, he would have cut down any threat to his authority without a second thought. But now, ironically, he was about to create a legacy that would surpass him. With a trembling exhale, he pulled Marjorie close, half out of genuine relief and half out of the knowledge that this was critical to his reign. If this child survived, the realm would have a future secured in the Baratheon name. Installment 5. Months passed, and Marjorie's pregnancy progressed without complication this time. The capital buzzed with anticipation of a royal heir. Even the lords who despised Joffrey recognized the advantage of a stable succession. The War of the Five Kings had taught them the perils of disputed claims. Invitations were sent across the realm to attend a grand celebration once the child was born. Craftsmen in King's Landing were commissioned to create cradles fit for a prince or princess. Tension, of course, lingered beneath the surface, but the veneer of unity grew thicker with each passing day of peace. Amidst this moment of relative calm, Joffrey received a disturbing raven from the north. Roose Bolton reported that a young boy had indeed been captured, claiming to be Rickon Stark, but he was feral and unrecognizable, starved and scarred. They were not even certain of his identity. Moreover, some of the captives' guardians had escaped into the wild, and pockets of the northern clans were beginning to stir, suspicious that the crown would end this rumored Stark's life. Joffrey's immediate inclination was to order the boy brought to King's Landing so he could assess the threat, and perhaps parade him as a hostage. But Tywin, with a fatherly tone that still unnerved his grandson, cautioned that the risk of transporting the alleged Stark through the entire kingdom might trigger a violent rescue attempt. Better, Tywin advised, to keep him in the north, locked away in the Dreadfort under careful guard. If the North rose in rebellion, they would know their so-called Stark was in Bolton hands. If they bowed, he would remain a forgotten footnote. The king weighed this counsel. A part of him wanted to bring the boy south, to remind Sansa Stark that any hope for her family's restoration was doomed. Yet Tywin's logic was impeccable. It was safer, more prudent to keep the threat contained far from the capital. With a nod, Joffrey approved the plan. He resolved to keep Sansa ignorant of the matter. Over the years, she had become a quiet presence in court, never fully trusted, never fully discarded. She moved like a ghost through the corridors, her eyes distant. Marjorie sometimes showed her small kindnesses, inviting her to teas, offering new garments, but Joffrey maintained a wary distance. He had not forgotten the times he had humiliated her, and he suspected she hadn't either. Better to let her remain an ornament of the court, neither free nor entirely caged. On the eve of Marjorie's due date, King's Landing erupted into celebration. Wine flowed through every district, courtesy of the Tyrell coffers. Musicians roamed the streets, playing cheerful tunes about the Baratheon stag and the Lannister lion. And in the Red Keep, Joffrey paced the floor of the royal bedchamber, anxiety gnawing at him in a way no battle ever had. All his conquests, all his cunning diplomacy, none of it mattered if he lost his child again. Marjorie's anguished cries resonated through the halls, and he clenched his fists. Hours later, as dawn broke, a healthy wail echoed across the corridor. A maester emerged to announce the birth of a prince. A swirl of euphoria carried Joffrey into the room. Marjorie, exhausted, lay propped on pillows, cradling a tiny bundle. The child's little fists waved weakly in the air. Joffrey approached with deliberate steps, almost frightened by the fragility of the moment. When he first held his son, an extraordinary rush of possessiveness seized him. This was his heir, the living bond between House Baratheon and House Tyrell, the future of the realm, and the proof that Joffrey's line would continue unchallenged. For a rare instant, the king forgot about wars, rebellions, and court intrigues. He was overwhelmed by the reality that something as small as an infant could matter more than all the crowns in Westeros. The city erupted in days of celebration. Processions of knights performed mock justs in the prince's honor. Gifts poured in from every corner of the kingdom. Fine silks from Dorne, golden goblets from the Westerlands, exotic spices from distant lands. The child, named Lionel after an old Baratheon ancestor, became the symbol of renewed hope for a realm that had suffered so much strife. Even the small folk who once spat at Joffrey's name now prayed for the boy's health, understanding that a stable succession could preserve the fragile peace. In the hush of the royal nursery, Joffrey found himself staring at his son in the cradle. The tiny face bore no trace of Lannister gold in the hair. Instead, the child's wisps were a light shade of brown, somewhere between Baratheon black and Tyrell brown. Could any of his subjects still whisper that Joffrey was a bastard born of incest? Here was a child who was undoubtedly of mixed heritage, reinforcing his claim through the mother's seat as well. It was almost poetic. The realm continued to settle under this new era. Taxes were collected more efficiently thanks to Littlefinger's cunning and the reorganization of the crown's bureaucracy. The roads, once littered with bandits, saw an increased presence of royal guards. Lannister gold, Tyrell grain, and Baratheon authority knitted together a tapestry of cautious stability. That is not to say all was idyllic. Whispers still circulated. In the Riverlands, discontent festered over old grievances. In the Iron Islands, newly stirred reavers tested their strength with sporadic raids. Yet compared to the War of the Five Kings, these were flickers, not conflagrations. The king addressed them with a mixture of intimidation and bribery, relying on the formula that had served him thus far. He rewarded those who knelt swiftly and crushed those who resisted him too openly. One day, as Joffrey strolled the gardens with Lionel bundled in his arms, he reflected on how far he had come since his coronation. He remembered the boy he had been, cruel, eager to flaunt power for the sake of his own sadistic pleasures. That spark still existed within him, he knew. Sometimes he felt it in the heat that rose behind his eyes whenever someone defied him. But he had learned to rein it in, to channel it toward a greater objective. Love him or hate him, he was determined that no one would deny he had brought a measure of prosperity to Westeros. Over time, as his rule extended beyond mere months into years, the realm began to accept that Joffrey Baratheon was not a transient tyrant. He was king, and he intended to remain so for a very long time. Installment 6. By the 5th year of Joffrey's reign, the Seven Kingdoms had begun to reshape themselves around him. Surviving lords and newly elevated bannermen understood the nature of his rule, show loyalty and benefit from the crown's protection and economic opportunities, or oppose him and risk swift retribution. Even Dorne had grown more accommodating, signing lucrative trade pacts that allowed Dornish wine to flow into King's Landing at reduced tariffs, thereby enriching both sides. The Boltons in the north kept their captive closely guarded, ensuring that any stirrings of a Stark revival were strangled before they could grow. Stannis remained in sullen isolation on Dragonstone, a relic of an old claim. During this period, Joffrey, with Tywin's counsel, implemented a sweeping reform of the crown's finances. The debts owed to the Iron Bank of Bravos were renegotiated, with Littlefinger orchestrating deals that would allow for longer repayment terms. This gave the crown breathing room to invest in infrastructure. Roads were repaired, seaports expanded, and sections of King's Landing were rebuilt, smarter and cleaner than before. Though some cynically viewed these projects as means to solidify Joffrey's legacy, they also produced real improvements for the populace, who found safer travel routes and better opportunities for trade. Within the court, Margaery shone as the beloved queen consort, frequently hosting charities and festivals. Lionel grew under her watchful eye, doted upon by the entire realm. Joffrey, for his part, divided his time between fatherhood, governance, and ensuring the loyalty of his bannermen. He established a habit of touring the realm, never too far from a strong military escort, of course. In these tours, he would meet with local lords, hear their petitions, and dispense justice with an air of regal confidence. When needed, he was merciless. Public executions for treason or banditry were still common enough to remind everyone not to test him. But after the War of the Five Kings, the common folk had grown tired of constant bloodshed. Many saw in Joffrey's iron hand a stability they had not known in years. There was a moment, almost comical in retrospect, when a band of Sparrow's religious zealots, outraged by perceived moral decay, attempted to stage a protest outside the Great September of Baelor. Joffrey, recalling how the faith militant had once challenged royal authority, dispatched his guards to disperse them. But in a surprising twist, he also commanded that the High Septons speak with their leaders, promising them a platform to discuss their grievances. He let them vent about corruption in the nobility, about the degradation of values. Some demands were outrageous, calling for a complete overthrow of the existing order. Those men were swiftly executed. The rest were given a small seat at the table, a concession to show that the king was not deaf to the cries of the devout. This maneuver minimized unrest while keeping the faith in check. Joffrey had learned that sometimes a controlled release of pressure was more effective than sealing the pot and letting it explode. Meanwhile, Sansa Stark remained a silent fixture in the Red Keep. Many believed Joffrey would eventually annul her betrothal or dispose of her, but he had found a subtle usefulness in her continued presence. She was a living testament to his victory over House Stark. Moreover, her calm demeanor, ever gracious, served as a reminder to the Northern Lords of what they had lost. Her survival, ironically, was a more potent tool of control than her death would ever be. When she occasionally dared to request permission to leave court, Joffrey would smile thinly and say, "Not yet," as if her departure might unravel carefully laid plans. Then came an event that tested Joffrey's resolution, the Greyjoy Rebellion. The Iron Islands, ever restless, decided that with the realm focused on rebuilding, it was time to assert their independence anew. Led by Victarion Greyjoy, they launched raids along the western coast, sacking small ports and capturing merchant vessels. It was a flagrant challenge to the crown, and many lords wondered if Joffrey would respond with fire or with the same tempered approach he had shown with the North. The king did not hesitate. He commanded the royal fleet, augmented by ships from House Redwyne in the Reach, to set sail immediately. Over the course of several brutal skirmishes at sea, the Ironborn realized that the crown was no longer weak or distracted. The newly fortified Royal Navy, well-trained and well-funded, proved a match for their famed reavers. In a final engagement near Fair Isle, the Ironborn lost their flagship and Victarion himself was captured. Joffrey sent emissaries to Pike, demanding their unconditional surrender. Balon Greyjoy, weary from his previous failures and facing the imminent threat of a full-scale invasion, agreed. The Iron Islands bent the knee once more. Joffrey seized the opportunity to extract tribute, imposing new taxes on the Ironborn as punishment for their uprising. He also claimed Victarion as a prisoner, parading him through the streets of King's Landing before finally exiling him to the Wall. A spectacle, yes, but also a statement. This is what becomes of those who think the crown is weak. The swift victory increased Joffrey's standing among the lords. Word spread that the king had broken the Ironborn with ruthless efficiency. Even the harshest critics had to admit that under Joffrey's rule, the realm had seen fewer prolonged conflicts. Trade routes once more flowed freely, and even the smallest hamlets felt the ripples of greater stability. This did not mean that everyone adored him, far from it. But fear and necessity proved effective allies to the crown. By the 10th year of Hai's reign, Joffrey was no longer a boy king but a man in his mid-20s, hardened by both war and the demands of leadership. His mother, Cersei, had gradually stepped back from direct involvement in governance, content to bask in the safety of the royal family's secure position. Tywin still served as hand, though he aged by the day. The king himself, however, was now the central architect of policy. His transformation from the petulant prince, who delighted in tormenting court fools, to a calculating monarch was evident for all to see. And while the flickers of cruelty remained, they were harnessed into a more disciplined shape. Installment 7. The 15th year of Joffrey's reign brought monumental change. The death of Tywin Lannister. The old lion passed away quietly in his sleep, leaving the realm without its most fearsome political strategist. Even as the bells of the Great September tolled in mourning, courtiers could not help but speculate on what this would mean for King Joffrey. Without Tywin's guiding hand, would the realm descend back into chaos? Or had the king truly learned all he needed from his grandfather? To the surprise of many, Tywin's absence did not weaken Joffrey's rule. Instead, it seemed to liberate him. He appointed a new hand, a lesser lord of impeccable loyalty, and continued to govern with a firm grip. Decades of Lannister wealth still backed the crown, and the Tyrell alliance remained strong. He had also forged ties with other key houses by strategically approving marriages, including matches for his younger siblings, if they existed in this alternative timeline, and for the children of loyal bannermen. By now, Lionel was a growing boy, with the curious eyes of a child who knew only a world where his father was unchallenged. Joffrey took pride in instructing the boy himself, teaching him the rudiments of swordsmanship and occasionally letting him observe the small council's meetings. In private moments, he would stand behind his son as the child peered at the map of Westeros, small fingers tracing the outlines of the various kingdoms. Joffrey felt a surge of satisfaction. This was his domain, and someday it would be Lionel's. The boy was calmer, less volatile than his father had been at that age, partly due to Margaery's influence, no doubt. Yet Joffrey did not want his heir to grow up soft. He impressed upon the child the value of decisiveness, recounting stories of how a single moment of hesitation could lose an entire kingdom. In the broader realm, life settled into a pattern of cautious prosperity. Sellsword companies turned into mercantile outfits, investing in caravans protected by ex-soldiers. The roads were kept relatively safe by the crown's forces. Even the small folk began to taste a semblance of better living, though they grumbled about taxes. But as taxes increased, so did the infrastructure they funded: bridges, roads, improved city walls. Joffrey's official pronouncements declared it a golden era of reconstruction, and while many scoffed at the hyperbole, there was an undeniable upswing in quality of life for a significant portion of the population. All the while, the king's cruelty manifested in more subtle ways. He would use the threat of force rather than the act itself to keep rebellious lords in line. When a minor lord in the Reach neglected to send the required levies, Joffrey invited him to King's Landing for a discussion. By the time the lord left the capital, he had relinquished a portion of his lands in compensation. Publicly, the king proclaimed it a mutual agreement. Privately, everyone knew it was an act of intimidation. Similar events played out across the realm as the crown strengthened its hold through legal pretexts and behind-closed-doors deals. Cersei, growing older, withdrew further from politics, spending more time at courtly functions and less time at the council table. Some speculated she was content to see her son surpass the need for her guidance. Others whispered that she feared him. Whether that was true or not, Joffrey rarely sought her counsel anymore. He had become his own master, shaped by experiences far more grueling than most kings ever knew. The 20th year of his reign arrived with another tragedy. Margaery fell ill with a fever that the maesters could not cure. For weeks, the queen lay bedridden, slipping in and out of delirium. Joffrey summoned healers from every corner of the realm, but none could turn the tide. With each passing day, the king's facade of unshakable composure cracked a little more. He lashed out at servants, threatened maesters with death if they failed, and then retreated into brooding silence by her bedside. When Margaery finally breathed her last, Joffrey was seen stumbling out of her chambers, face contorted in rage and grief. The city prepared itself for a return to the old, merciless king. Some predicted a purge or a wave of cruelty to vent his anguish. But instead, Joffrey sank into a quieter, more cold-blooded determination. He ordered a lavish funeral attended by thousands who wished to honor the beloved queen. The silent king stood at the ceremony with Lionel by his side, the child clutching his father's hand. Black banners draped the streets, and for the first time in memory, the capital felt a collective sorrow that even overshadowed the old war wounds. Margaery had been their bridge to Joffrey's better nature, and her absence was palpable. In the months following her death, the king grew more distant, burying himself in governance. Lionel became the center of his personal life, the living reminder that something of Margaery still remained. Joffrey ensured that the boy received the best tutors, knights, and maesters. He redoubled efforts to expand the crown's influence, as if chasing the ghost of a future he and Margaery had once imagined. Some older courtiers noted that the king's cruelty flared less frequently in public. But when it did, it was sharper, more lethal. Where once he might have thrown a tantrum, he now unleashed a calculated punishment. And there were no second chances given to those he deemed guilty. Still, despite Margaery's passing, the realm did not unravel. Too many people depended on the stability that Joffrey provided. Lords who harbored personal grudges conceded that a stable king was better than another civil war. The North, effectively governed through the Boltons, remained calm. The Riverlands, forcibly repaired after the war, produced bountiful harvests. King's Landing continued to grow in size and splendor, with new districts built where old slums had once stood. Installment 8. By the 30th year of Joffrey's reign, the king was in his prime. Years of cautious statecraft and unrelenting will had molded the Seven Kingdoms into a realm that, while not free of fear, enjoyed a kind of enforced peace. Major rebellions had been quashed or never allowed to ignite. Trade flourished with Essos, and the crown's coffers brimmed with gold, some of which was used to continue the expansion of the navy and improvements in major cities like Lannisport and Gulltown. Even the dusty roads of the Dornish border saw patrols of soldiers who kept the bandits at bay. Yet time is the one enemy no king can conquer forever. As Joffrey crossed into middle age, lines of tension appeared on his brow. His once bright hair, more Baratheon than Lannister, began to show streaks of gray. Lionel, now a young man in his own right, stood taller than his father, inheriting Marjorie's easy charm but also tempered by the discipline Joffrey had drilled into him. He moved among the courtiers with the confidence of a prince who had never known the chaos of a disputed throne. Many lords already looked to him as a symbol of the future, a generation untouched by the horrors of the War of the Five Kings. Strangely, Joffrey found himself reflecting on his earlier years with a sense of detachment. He remembered how the sight of a man's blood used to thrill him. Now it felt like a distant echo of a boy he barely recognized. He had spilled enough blood to secure his reign. If violence was needed again, he would not hesitate, but it no longer consumed him as it once had. Instead, he was consumed with a different fire, an obsession with his legacy. He wanted to be remembered as the king who rebuilt the realm, not just the boy who cruelly toyed with the powerless. His pride demanded that history regard him as a conqueror of chaos. Thus, he commissioned works of art and architecture. Statues carved in his likeness, grand halls adorned with tapestries depicting the War of the Five Kings from his perspective. He funded the enlargement of the royal library, inviting scholars from across the narrow sea to share knowledge. These scholars sometimes whispered, amused, that the king sought to rewrite the narrative of his youth. And perhaps they were right. Joffrey had decided that if he could not change the past, he would shape how future generations remembered it. At court, the aging king took on a paternal role, guiding younger lords, cautioning them not to repeat the mistakes that had once bled the realm dry. Here and there, he would still flare with impatience, especially when confronted by anyone he deemed incompetent. He dismissed a master of coin who had grown lax with the treasury, ordering a public flogging before exiling the man. Incidents like these reminded everyone that beneath the veneer of the Builder King still lurked the venom of a scorpion. Beyond the capital, winter eventually descended, covering the north and creeping slowly south. Unlike previous winters that caught the realm unprepared, Joffrey had spent years stockpiling grain in massive storehouses. The king's provisioning allowed the small folk to endure the cold months without the devastation that had characterized earlier winters. This reinforced his reputation as a ruler who planned ahead. The North, under Bolton governance, persevered through the harsh cold but sent pleas for additional aid. Joffrey, calculating the benefits, decided to grant them extra supplies at a price. Winter would eventually end, but memories of who kept them fed would remain. It was another thread binding the realm closer to the Iron Throne. As the 35th year of his reign approached, rumors began to stir about the king's health. Court physicians noted that while Joffrey was still strong, the stress of rulership had taken its toll. He developed a persistent cough, and sometimes in the morning, he would feel shooting pains in his limbs. There were hushes in the corridors about whether the king should begin delegating more responsibilities to Prince Lionel, who by now had proven himself a competent leader in various administrative tasks. But Joffrey resisted any talk of abdication. He had fought too hard to secure this throne. He would not relinquish it until he drew his last breath. Installment 9, nearing 40 years on the throne, Joffrey celebrated his 50th name day with a week-long festival in King's Landing. The streets were decorated with flags bearing the crowned stag sigil and the golden lion, a reminder of the lineage that had forged his power. Lionel, now a man in his early 30s, presided over many of the festivities, justs, and feasts, as his father watched with guarded pride. Musicians traveled from bravos and pentos to perform exotic pieces, while Dornish dancers enthralled the crowds. Wine flowed freely, and the small folk were invited to partake in the revelry. The city hadn't seen such grandeur since Joffrey's early coronation days. The king himself, graying and more reserved, made a rare public speech from the balcony of the Red Keep. He spoke of the realm's unity, of the struggles they had endured and overcome. He thanked the gods for the peace that had reigned for so long, an ironic statement from the man who once sneered at the concept of mercy. Yet the crowd roared in approval, for they knew that while Joffrey's methods had been harsh, they had not been subjected to another devastating war under his watch. Many in the audience were too young to remember the chaotic bloodshed of the War of the Five Kings, and so their cheers were sincere. In private, however, Joffrey felt the weight of every passing year. He had outlived his most dangerous enemies, seeing them fall to age, disease, or strategic marriages that blunted their rebellious edge. Even so, memories plagued him, faces of those he had wronged, images of battles, the fleeting warmth of Marjorie's final days. Sometimes he would walk through the crypts of the Red Keep at night, letting the cold torchlight reveal the statues of past kings and queens, wondering how he would measure up in the annals of history. In his 50th year of rule, the realm faced a new threat from beyond the Narrow Sea. A mercenary king, styling himself as the Golden Emperor, had seized control of a city-state in Essos. His corsairs began raiding the coasts, attacking ships under Westerosi flags. Joffrey responded decisively, dispatching the Royal Navy to intercept these raiders. Lionel took command of the fleet, proving himself his father's son by orchestrating a brilliant series of engagements that decimated the Essosi ships. The crisis never escalated into a full-blown invasion, but it reminded Westeros that the world was larger than their internal struggles. Word came back that the Golden Emperor had retreated further inland, licking his wounds and promising vengeance. But it never materialized in Joffrey's lifetime. In these final years, Joffrey saw less of the day-to-day details of governance, entrusting many duties to Lionel and a carefully selected small council. He spent more time in reflection, penning letters to distant lords, ensuring old loyalties were maintained. He also made sure that Sansa Stark, now a woman who had spent the majority of her life under his shadow, remained in King's Landing. She was given a comfortable suite, but not the freedom to leave. Some at court found it cruel, a final petty gesture of a king who refused to release the last living remnant of the Stark legacy. But Joffrey saw it as a necessary precaution. Rumor had reached him that if Sansa were ever freed, the North might rally around her. And so, year after year, she stayed, polite but distant, her eyes reflecting a lifetime of regret and resignation. Shortly after Joffrey turned 51, he fell gravely ill. The same cough that had plagued him off and on for years worsened. Fever claimed him, and he spent his final days in a haze, drifting between delirium and fleeting moments of lucidity. In these rare lucid moments, he would grip Lionel's hand and urge him to be strong, to rule with both cunning and compassion. No one knew if the king truly felt remorse for his past cruelties, or if he was merely passing on lessons learned the hard way. But the image of an ailing Joffrey Baratheon, once the terror of King's Landing, whispering fatherly advice to his grown son, was enough to silence the court's usual gossip. His death was neither dramatic nor quiet. It happened on a stormy night, thunder rattling the windows of the Red Keep. Some swore they heard the king's final breaths echo through the corridors. The bells tolled in mourning the next day, and across Westeros, people reacted in different ways. Some wept, for they had known only his rule and believed he had ushered in an era of surprising stability. Others celebrated quietly, recalling the old stories of a sadistic boy king. Regardless of personal sentiment, everyone acknowledged that the realm he left behind was far stronger, more unified, and wealthier than the one he had inherited amid the ashes of civil war. And so ended the reign of Joffrey Baratheon, the boy who became king and refused to relinquish his hold on the throne for 5 long decades. History would debate whether he had been a necessary tyrant or a cunning ruler who genuinely matured into his crown. Some bards would sing of him as the king who built roads and libraries, who forged alliances and tamed the Iron Islands. Others would recount the horrors of his youth, the lives he destroyed, and the families he scattered. But no one could deny that he had shaped Westeros in his image, and in doing so, he had altered the course of its history for generations to come. Joffrey Baratheon's first taste of power came swathed in blood and chaos. He had ascended to the Iron Throne in the midst of what the singers would later call the War of the Five Kings, though Joffrey himself dismissed it as an inevitable struggle where only one outcome was ever possible, his. The victory was far from gentle. Entire houses had been brought to heel, the streets of King's Landing were awash in whispers of cruelty, and few among the surviving lords doubted that the young king had a violent streak that could match even the darkest Targaryen legends. Yet in this alternative strand of fate, he neither fell victim to poison nor to the daggers of conspirators. Instead, he endured and gradually refined the raw edges of his nature. Through wits, gold, and brutal opportunism, he managed to preside over the 7 kingdoms for half a century. These 50 years saw the realm reshaped, forced under the steady pressure of his will until all men, whether they despised or revered him, had to concede that King Joffrey had truly become the master of the Iron Throne. He was but a boy when he claimed the crown, pale-haired and proud, lips often twisted in a sneer that promised torment to those who displeased him. King's Landing remembered him first and foremost as a youth who exulted in displays of power. But on the eve of his greatest triumph, when Stannis Baratheon's forces were broken at the Blackwater and House Stark's cause lay sundered, Joffrey recognized that ruling involved far more than slaking his thirst for fear. He understood, albeit fitfully at first, that to wear the crown was to endure every threat, every intrigue, and to keep one's head atop one's shoulders by outmaneuvering all rivals. Even as he tormented courtiers and flaunted his disdain for weakness, the cunning lessons of Tywin Lannister and Cersei Lannister took root. He learned that even cruelty must be measured if the aim is to govern a realm, not just ravage it. The day after his formal coronation, the sun burned bright over King's Landing as though mocking the city's lingering anxieties. Small folk lined the streets for a glimpse of their new king. Whether they cheered from actual devotion or from relief that a victor had at last emerged hardly mattered. Joffrey drank in the sound of their adulation, real or forced, and discovered within himself a taste for it. He wore the crown of gold and rubies that had once sat upon Robert Baratheon's head, though now it was refashioned to include a subtle ring of lion heads. The boy was determined to announce his dual heritage, stag and lion, Baratheon and Lannister, unstoppable so long as he retained the wealth and influence of both lines. On this day, as banners bearing the lion and stag motif fluttered from the ramparts, the small folk might have sworn that Joffrey was a figure carved from living gold, a regal presence far beyond his 15 years. But behind his aloof smile flickered the memory of the chaos he had just survived and the fresh realization that he would need to hold on to power with every fiber of his being. Tywin Lannister, fresh from routing all meaningful opposition, made sure to place himself near his grandson during every public appearance. The old lion still radiated the cool, controlled menace that had been the hallmark of House Lannister's ascension. Even when Joffrey embraced the crowd's cheers, Tywin would stand just behind him, reminding him in hushed tones that the realm was not fully pacified. Robb Stark's demise had neutral eyes the north, but rebel outposts still lurked among the Wolf's Wood and the Mountains of the Moon. Stannis remained on Dragonstone, a smoldering threat that might yet reemerge. The Riverlands were battered, but their loyalty would need tending. And perhaps most vexing, rumors persisted that the Tyrells had not been wholly satisfied with the deals made to ensure their alliance. The king was reminded that a war might be won in the field, but consolidating that victory in peace was another kind of battle entirely. Despite these whispers, Joffrey found an easy pride in strutting through the marble halls of the Red Keep. He relished the lavish coronation feast, a triumphal riot of food, wine, and ostentation that spilled across the city for days. Lords and ladies from every corner of Westeros arrived, some with genuine deference, others biting their tongues in the face of his unpredictable temper. But none dared openly defy him, not in a city swarming with Lannister men and gold cloaks fiercely loyal to the crown's gold. On the third day of feasting, Joffrey commanded a joust. Knights arrayed in glittering plate thundered down the lists, lances striking steel shields with deafening force. He watched from the royal box, Margaery Tyrell seated at his side in a gown of shimmering green. Though the match had originally been Renly Baratheon's, hastily broken by war, Joffrey recognized the political advantage of binding House Tyrell to him through marriage. The courtiers commented on how the delicate rose that was Margaery managed to look almost serene even beneath the king's close scrutiny. No sooner had the celebrations ended than Joffrey confronted his first challenge. The North refused to yield completely. Certain lords, Umber, Karstark, and others remained too embittered by the Red Wedding, an event Joffrey barely acknowledged but from which he had benefited. Rather than send an army to break them, Joffrey surprised everyone by first sending envoys offering terms. The North, he declared, would be granted a form of self-governance under the crown's authority with lighter taxes for a set period to help them recover from the ravages of war. Furthermore, any lord who bent the knee promptly would earn a royal pardon. Many in the small council were baffled. Was this not the same boy who once tortured animals for sport, who ordered beatings at a whim? Yet Joffrey wore a coldly confident smirk as he announced the plan. The realm would see him as merciful, he explained, and if the North refused to accept these terms, he would have justification to unleash fury upon them. That was the tenor of his new approach, cruelty deployed for strategic ends rather than for idle amusement. Tywin offered the barest hint of approval, remarking that such a measure might prove that House Lannister's cunning ran in the boy's blood after all. The North, decimated by war, accepted. Pockets of outlaws still prowled the forests, but the major houses, suffering from famine and bitter cold, yielded to the lure of royal clemency. Sansa Stark, forced to remain at court, watched this news with silent desolation. She had no illusions about Joffrey's underlying nature, but even she recognized how effective he could be when guided by cunning rather than mindless cruelty. For her, the notion that the North would bend the knee to the boy she both feared and hated seemed an impossible betrayal. Yet the embers of hope still glowed faintly. She lived like a prisoner in the Red Keep, outwardly treated as a ward, allowed to wander the gardens but never permitted to leave the city. Some courtiers remarked that it might have been better for Joffrey to end her life, but he saw the advantage of keeping a Stark princess at his side. Sansa became living proof to the entire North that any renewed rebellion would cost them dearly. Margaery Tyrell's presence also began to mellow some of the king's darker impulses. She was as shrewd as she was kind, never openly contradicting Joffrey but patiently leading him to see how acts of calculated benevolence could yield power far more enduring than random terror. It was Margaery who convinced him to provide bread and simple pottages to the starving small folk in King's Landing during a lean winter. It was Margaery who urged him to hold court in the Great Hall at least twice a fortnight, hearing the petitions of commoners and lesser lords alike. Initially, Joffrey endured these sessions out of reluctant curiosity. He enjoyed being able to sneer at fools who begged for coin or farmland. But he also noticed that each act of mercy he bestowed, a remission of taxes here, a helping hand in restocking seeds there, earned him a fresh wave of grateful subjects. The boy king began to grasp that fear alone might keep a throne, but fear combined with occasional generosity could cement a dynasty. Still, he could never fully douse the flame of his cruelty. On more than one occasion, a petitioner who annoyed him found himself tossed bodily from the hall, or worse, cast into a black cell under the Red Keep. When a street performer made a jest at the king's expense, Joffrey had him flogged and tossed back into Flea Bottom as a warning to others. These outbursts were not as frequent as they had been in his youth, but they reminded everyone that the king's tolerance had razor-sharp limits. Those who had once known the unbridled violence of his childhood flinched at the memory, but they also recognized that a careful balance was emerging. He was learning, from Tywin and Margaery both, how to harness his darker instincts without letting them consume him. In the second year of his reign, Joffrey visited the Reach at Margaery's behest. The Tyrells required royal support to fend off a band of raiders near the Dornish marches, remnants of opportunists left over from Renly Baratheon's lost cause. Many had anticipated that Joffrey would let them handle it on their own, but he saw advantage in making a personal appearance. Traveling with an impressive retinue of Lannister and Crown Knights, he crushed the raiders decisively. This gave him a chance to display his prowess on the field, though the actual fighting was largely handled by skilled commanders. Once the threat was subdued, he toured the outlying farmland, ensuring that the peasants who paid fealty to the Tyrells knew who had saved them. Whispers circulated that King Joffrey was no longer content to be a cruel puppet behind the city walls. He was stepping forth as a ruler who wanted the realm to see him leading from the front. Upon returning to King's Landing, he found another crisis festering, a plague in Flea Bottom. The cramped, rat-infested hovels beneath the Red Keep had bred an outbreak that threatened to spiral out of control. Faced with the possibility of disease spreading into the higher districts, Joffrey swiftly ordered a quarantine. Barricades rose around Flea Bottom and gold cloaks marched the perimeter, keeping the infected from spilling into the rest of the city. At the same time, Margaery pleaded for more direct intervention. Joffrey grudgingly allowed Grand Maester Pycelle and the city's appointed surgeons to deliver basic medicines and loaves of bread to those trapped behind the quarantine lines. The combination of harsh containment and measured relief eventually halted the spread, and while hundreds died, the city survived. Rumors circulated that the king had considered letting Flea Bottom starve to eradicate the disease altogether. Whether that was true or not, he ultimately chose a more balanced path that left many small folk surprised. A monarch once known for petty torments had, in his own way, worked to save them, if only to protect himself and his seat of power. That same year, Joffrey wed Margaery Tyrell in a lavish ceremony that united House Baratheon Lannister with House Tyrell more definitively. The Great September of Baelor shimmered with 1,000 candles, and the High Septon solemnly proclaimed their union. Commoners gathered outside, hoping for a glimpse of the bride whose beauty had captured the hearts of so many. Joffrey wore a cloak of gold-trimmed black, Marjorie's gown blended Tyrell green with golden thread, signifying their union before the Seven. Through that marriage, the wealth and grain of the Reach coupled with the Lannisters' gold, feeding a realm that was finally beginning to see an end to the starvation caused by the war. Celebrations spilled across the city for days, culminating in a tourney where knights from every corner of the Seven Kingdoms sought to win the favor of the new queen. Joffrey, flush with victory in both war and marriage, now turned his gaze toward the north once more. Letters from Roose Bolton arrived in the capital with a steady cadence, reporting on outlaws who claimed to fight in the name of House Stark. While the major noble houses had bent the knee, scattered bands of loyalists continued to harass Bolton outposts. Rumors also suggested the possible survival of a younger Stark child, Rickon, if the stories were to be believed. Joffrey weighed his options. He knew that mobilizing another massed army so soon after the war could strain the realm's fragile stability. Moreover, he had gleaned from Tywin that the Boltons were loyal only so long as it served their ambitions. After some debate in the small council, he agreed to allow Bolton to deal with the rebels himself, provided he did so decisively and didn't let the conflict spiral into a fresh war. Bolton assured the king he would handle matters, though the man's quiet monotone and his bastard son Ramsay's eerie grin left even Joffrey with an uneasy feeling. In the following years, Joffrey's reign settled into a carefully orchestrated dance of intimidation and favor. He raised taxes on lords who showed the slightest inclination to rebel, but he also funneled gold into repairing roads and ports, bolstering trade throughout the Seven Kingdoms. Shipyards at King's Landing and in the Reach bustled with activity, forging a more formidable royal navy to prevent any new threat from pirates or exiled claimants. The Iron Islands, resentful under the rule of a Baratheon again, tested his patience by staging minor raids along the western coasts. Joffrey responded with a swift show of force, dispatching the newly expanded navy to burn a few Ironborn ships in their own harbors. That lesson silenced Balon Greyjoy, who had lost too many sons to war already. Winter was approaching, after all, and the Ironborn could ill afford to anger a king who had the might of the Lannisters and the Tyrells behind him. Over time, the city itself began to change under his rule. King's Landing, once a warren of impoverished back alleys and cramped wooden buildings, saw sections rebuilt with stone. The worst of Flea Bottom was partially cleared to make room for expanded marketplaces. Although cynics muttered that this served to line the pockets of corrupt officials and favored contractors, there was no denying that parts of King's Landing grew cleaner and slightly safer. Residents who recalled the horrors of the sack of King's Landing and the more recent riots marveled at the difference a few short years could make, especially when the crown poured money into what Joffrey called modernizing the city. The improvements, though not purely benevolent, helped stabilize his grip as well. A better provisioned and better guarded capital was far less likely to rise up against him as it had against past Targaryen rulers. Marjorie had her own influence on the transformation of court life. She established charitable events for war widows and orphans, urging Joffrey to appear at a few of them. Though his smiles were sometimes stiff and his courtesy often forced, he gradually recognized the political value in allowing the people to see him in a kinder light. The newly formed orphanages and infirmaries were done under the joint sigils of the Crowned Stag and the Golden Rose, a testament to the partnership that had brought House Tyrell into full alliance with the crown. Joffrey's mother, Cersei, watched these developments with guarded eyes. While she had always encouraged her son's rule, she sometimes grew uneasy at seeing Marjorie's influence reshape him. Cersei understood power as something best gripped tightly and used to crush all opposition. She had taught Joffrey early on that fear was the most reliable tool of a monarch. But now she sensed that, for better or worse, Marjorie's advice was enabling him to blend that fear with a measure of hope. And the combination, if properly wielded, could prove far more dangerous to the king's enemies than raw cruelty alone. In the third year of his reign, the realm faced a bitter winter that swept down from the north earlier than most maesters had predicted. Grain stores ran low and tensions rose in rural regions. Local lords, many still nursing the wounds of the Civil War, complained that they could not feed both their peasants and the tax collectors from King's Landing. Joffrey, guided by Marjorie and Tywin, made a strategic decision. He reduced certain levies for a season, allowing the small folk enough respite to avoid outright starvation. Cynics pointed out that an underfed peasantry would produce fewer tax revenues in the long run, while the more perceptive among the nobility realized that the king was managing to appear merciful yet again. He even opened the royal granaries near King's Landing to distribute limited rations, though the process was carefully overseen by gold cloaks to prevent any riots. The small folk facing hunger at their door received these meager rations as blessings. For the first time in living memory, they began to speak of King Joffrey as a ruler who truly understood the burdens of the populace. Perhaps it was merely good policy, but it worked wonders for his reputation. Shortly after Winter's arrival, Margaery announced she was expecting a child. The news electrified the court. Lords and ladies speculated that an heir to Joffrey's line would further stabilize the realm. Yet in the 5th month, she lost the baby, and a palpable sorrow weighed upon King's Landing. Joffrey, never one to show weakness, maintained a rigid composure in public. But in private, he raged at the maesters, accusing them of incompetence, blaming the gods, even lashing out at Margaery's ladies-in-waiting. Eventually, the torrent of his fury subsided, replaced by an uncharacteristic introspection. He realized that for all his power, he could not force destiny to produce an heir. The experience changed him subtly, turning some measure of his arrogance inward, so that he began to plan more meticulously, uncertain of what the future might hold. Perhaps the gods had not entirely forsaken him. For the following year, Margaery conceived again. This time, the pregnancy progressed to term, and on a chilly morning that carried the scent of fires burning in distant hearths, she gave birth to a son. The city erupted in celebration. Joffrey named the boy Lionel, after an old Baratheon ancestor, to honor his father's line. The child, healthy and lively, soon became the center of royal life. Courtiers jockeyed for influence, hoping to become the prince's tutors or guards. Margaery, pale but triumphant, cradled him in her arms for all to see. Even the small folk rejoiced, for an heir implied continuity, a respite from the dreaded uncertainty that had plagued the realm during the War of the Five Kings. Joffrey, holding his infant son, experienced a rare and potent rush of emotions: love, pride, and an even sharper fear of losing what he had gained. The birth of a royal heir did not free Joffrey from constant vigilance. Stannis Baratheon still lurked on Dragonstone, issuing proclamations that he was the one true king. Most of Westeros dismissed these claims, but Joffrey recognized that the man's fanaticism could prove dangerous if left unchecked. So he used spies, hired through the Master of Whisperers, to keep close watch on Dragonstone's movements. Fortunately for Joffrey, Stannis seemed low on men and resources, crippled by past defeats. No significant alliances came to bolster his claim. As the years passed, the Master of Dragonstone faded into an afterthought, a living reminder of how the War of the Five Kings might have ended differently had fate, along with gold and cunning, tilted another way. Over the next several years, Joffrey's rule matured. He continued to blend fear with strategic acts of clemency, forging a realm that, if not entirely content, was at least more stable than it had been. He reorganized the royal bureaucracy, putting individuals like Peter Baelish Littlefinger into key positions where they could coax revenues from trade and taxes. Littlefinger, always opportunistic, lined his own pockets as well, but he made sure the crown's coffers expanded. The king's supporters lauded the improvements in commerce. His detractors pointed to the extravagance spent on tournaments and feasts, claiming that Joffrey was still squandering precious gold. Yet these public events had a unifying effect. For every nightly contest, the people received a spectacle, which in turn solidified the king's image as a lavish but effective monarch. Meanwhile, Tywin Lannister's firm hand at the small council ensured that no lord grew too independent or amassed enough strength to challenge the throne. When the Iron Islands attempted a fresh rebellion under Victarion Greyjoy, seeking to take advantage of what they perceived as a complacent capital, they quickly learned that Joffrey had expanded the Royal Navy too effectively. Swift naval battles near the coast of the Westerlands ended with Iron-born ships sinking to the bottom of the sea. Victarion himself was captured and later exiled to the Wall. In a stark public display, Joffrey had him paraded through King's Landing in chains. The incident hammered home the reality that the crown, far from being vulnerable, had grown more powerful through a decade of enforced peace and methodical investment. By the 10th year of his reign, Joffrey was no longer a callow youth but a man in his mid-20s. The realm remembered the savage child he had been, yet stories began to circulate that the king had mellowed. Some believed it was all thanks to Margaery Tyrell's influence. Others insisted that Tywin's lessons had finally taken root. A few courtiers who had seen him dispatch traitors without a flicker of remorse swore that the cruelty remained, merely channeled into more systematic methods. Whatever the truth, the Seven Kingdoms had grown calmer under Joffrey Baratheon than anyone might have dreamed during those bloody years of civil war. He pressed for improvements to the realm's roads, following his father Robert's grudging acknowledgement that a realm could never be truly prosperous without safe passages for trade. Inns and watchtowers rose in intervals along the major routes, manned by crown-appointed guards whose loyalty was assured by decent wages and the threat of severe punishment if they strayed. Banditry declined, and merchants from the free cities began to favor King's Landing for their wares, bolstering a thriving market district. Even Flea Bottom saw some marginal benefit as the city's economy grew. The capital's population was no longer solely the poor and desperate, for travelers seeking opportunity arrived in droves. Sansa Stark, still a near prisoner in the Red Keep, was granted a set of chambers close to Marjorie's. She quietly accepted her fate, having learned that direct defiance would yield nothing but pain. There were times when her eyes flickered with a longing for the snowbound north, for the vanished days of her father's court at Winterfell. But Joffrey, after noticing her persistent silence, found that he preferred having her close by as a symbol of the North's subjugation. If he ever needed leverage against the last vestiges of Stark loyalists, Sansa would be it. He treated her with distant courtesy, allowing her to attend court festivities, even gifting her new gowns when the occasion required it. Yet the unspoken chain that tethered her to King's Landing never loosened. She remained a living reminder of how far the once proud House Stark had fallen. The years slipped by with a surprising lack of major insurrections. Here and there, a minor lord tested the crown's patience, only to face swift retribution. Men learned to fear the gold antlers of House Baratheon once more, as well as the hidden claws of the lion. The watchful eyes of the Master of Whisperers and the unyielding judgment of Tywin Lannister kept the realm cohesive. As winter lifted and summers came and went, Joffrey's rule appeared to be forging a legacy of relative peace. Yet even a king who rules by fear and cunning cannot evade the unstoppable march of time. By the 15th year of his reign, silver threads began to appear in Joffrey's once fair hair. Tywin, growing older, maintained his role as hand but moved more slowly, and his stern gaze seemed clouded by the awareness of his own mortality. Cersei retreated from active governance, choosing instead to host courtly gatherings and lavish feasts. Marjorie remained deeply involved in the philanthropic ventures she had established, though her health began to show signs of strain. Childbirth, public duties, and the endless emotional labor of tempering her husband had taken their toll. When Marjorie fell seriously ill in Joffrey's 20th year, the king nearly came undone. Her fever raged for weeks, and the maesters could do little. He threatened to have them all executed if they failed to save her, but no amount of threats could change the ebb of life within her. She died in the early hours of a cold autumn morning, leaving behind their son Lionel and a court that feared how Joffrey might react. Grief mingled with rage, but the king did not unleash a wave of terror as some predicted. Instead, he turned inward, his eyes hollow with loss. A grand funeral was held in the Great September of Baelor. Bells tolled across the city, thousands thronged the streets, and black banners replaced the gold for a season. In the aftermath, Joffrey wore his grief like a cold mantle, rarely speaking of his late wife. But in private, he sometimes visited the gardens she had loved, standing among the roses and letting the night air wash over him. The sorrow did not break him. If anything, it deepened his resolve to maintain order in the realm. Lionel, growing into a young man with echoes of Marjorie's gentle charm, became his father's anchor. Joffrey instructed him in the arts of governance, ensuring he learned from the mistakes of his own youth. In council sessions, the king would have Lionel stand behind him, observing how laws were debated and alliances forged. Courtiers remarked that the prince had inherited the best traits of both parents. He moved with the easy confidence of a Tyrell, but possessed a trace of his father's steely resolve. As the decades wore on, Joffrey's dominion over the Seven Kingdoms became entrenched. The North, effectively ruled by Roose Bolton and his heirs, maintained a grudging loyalty, always under watch from the Iron Throne. The Riverlands prospered again under Edmure Tully's wary administration, though none forgot that House Tully had once been conquered and humiliated. The Vale of Arryn, relatively unscathed by the war, grew in strength, but remained too isolated by geography to challenge the throne openly. Dorne, forever proud, continued to chafe under Lannister Baratheon dominance, but repeated trade concessions and diplomatic marriages soothed their worst resentments. The Stormlands, Robert Baratheon's old domain, rallied to Joffrey's banner after the final downfall of Stannis, though their loyalty was tempered by memories of the past. In the capital, the city changed still further. Under Joffrey's orders, new walls were erected to enclose the expanding districts. Infrastructure, bridges, aqueducts, even a nascent sewer system, was funded by the crown to minimize disease outbreaks. The king wanted a city that reflected his power, not the squalid labyrinth that had once nearly devoured him in riots. Taverns and inns flourished along the improved roads, and commerce with Essos increased significantly. Gold from the crown's coffers paid for foreign engineers to come and improve ports along the Blackwater Bay. The old dream of uniting the Seven Kingdoms in more than just name began to crystallize in small but tangible ways. Whether out of genuine altruism or Joffrey's thirst for a legacy, none could be certain. Tywin Lannister's death, in the 15th year of Joffrey's rule, sent tremors through the court. Many had believed Tywin's guiding hand was the keystone of Joffrey's stability. His passing in his sleep, just as the city's bells welcomed a new dawn, left the king without his most formidable tutor. At the funeral, Joffrey appeared composed, though a glint in his eye suggested he felt liberated. He named a loyalist lord as the new hand, a man whose cunning was respectable but who could never overshadow the king as Tywin once had. Some watchers expected turmoil, but by then, Joffrey's grip was strong enough to endure. He had learned the game of power through a crucible of violence, heartbreak, and the quiet manipulations of those around him. He no longer needed Tywin standing behind him. By the 30th year, Joffrey was in his middle age, lines of stress and experience etched into his features. He had long since exchanged the sullen sneer of youth for a measured, piercing gaze that could still unnerve lords and ladies. Lionel, grown to a vigorous young prince, took on more responsibilities in court, beloved by many for his more temperate manner. Yet no one forgot who truly sat on the Iron Throne. Joffrey still dispensed justice with a decisive hand. When an influential Reach Lord refused to pay a newly increased tax, the king had him invited to King's Landing and quietly compelled him to surrender a portion of his lands. Publicly, they issued a statement proclaiming a mutual agreement, but the rumor of the Lord's trembling departure left no doubt that he had been threatened. Cersei, now a dowager queen of sorts, spent her days in a haze of wine and gossip. She had once steered her son's course with a ruthless hand, but age and the repeated reminders of Joffrey's autonomy pushed her to the sidelines. She sometimes entertained visiting nobles, spinning stories of the war, boasting of Joffrey's might. Some claimed she remained proud beyond measure that her child had outlasted all rivals. Others whispered that she harbored a subtle dread of him, for she knew he had surpassed her in both cunning and cruelty. Over time, the king's personal tragedies compounded. Margaery's death had left him a widower, and while many proposed new marriages to secure fresh alliances, Joffrey rebuffed them all. Lionel was old enough to be recognized as the heir, and his father seemed uninterested in taking another queen, though he occasionally entertained courtly paramours. Occasionally, bards sang sweet ballads about the lost love that had tempered the king's heart. They were careful never to cross the line into mockery, for fear that the king's wrath might descend upon them. As Joffrey advanced further in years, occasional rumors of supernatural threats in the far north, whispers of reawakened legends and icy terrors circulated, but none were confirmed. Scouts and rangers from the Wall sent back conflicting reports, and the king, preoccupied with the demands of the realm, never allowed these rumors to disrupt his focus. If White Walkers indeed roamed the far edges of the wilderness, they remained distant, and Joffrey had no patience for unverified threats beyond the battered remains of House Stark's domain. The only visible menace from beyond Westeros came in the form of a self-styled Golden Emperor who briefly rose in Essos, sending corsairs to raid coastal villages. Joffrey and Lionel orchestrated a naval response that shattered the invaders, driving them back across the sea. Westeros stood secure once again, and Joffrey's proudest defenders heralded the operation as proof of his unshakable dominion. By the 40th year of Joffrey's rule, time had carved lines into his face. His hair, once rumored to be golden, bore the streaks of gray that often visit men who have wrestled with power for decades. Lionel, now a man in his early 30s, commanded respect from lords and knights. He began to lead councils more frequently, yet always under his father's keen gaze. In truth, Joffrey felt the press of age, plagued by a persistent cough and aches that would not entirely fade, but he refused to relinquish the throne. He had paid too dearly to gain it. He would not see it slip from his grasp while he still breathed. For his 50th name day, the capital exploded in celebration. Festivities stretched for a week, jousts, feasts, masks, and parades that wound through the city's improved streets. The king, less inclined to prance about in public, allowed Lionel to open many of the events, though he made a grand speech from a balcony overlooking a roaring crowd. He spoke of the realm's triumph over the chaos that had once threatened to tear it apart, and of his pride in the stability now reigning across Westeros. The same folk who had once spat at the mention of Joffrey's name in Flea Bottom now cheered him, some out of genuine gratitude for a life free of war, others because they had not known the horrors of the war that elevated him in the first place. The older generation remembered how he used to hold power like a whip, but for the younger men and women in the streets, Joffrey Baratheon was the only king they had ever known. Sansa Stark, by then a woman whose youth had faded within the Red Keep's confines, watched from a secluded window. She had spent more than half her life in the shadow of this king, allowed every comfort except freedom. From afar, she saw the city's cheers and wondered if her family's ghosts could ever forgive such a thing. If the North still whispered the names of the Starks, they did so in secret, for House Bolton kept them under a tight fist in the name of the Iron Throne. It was a legacy of quiet heartbreak that no one beyond the darkest corners of Winterfell's crypts dared to speak of openly. In the 51st year of Joffrey's reign, he finally fell ill. His cough returned, fiercer than before, bringing fevers that sapped his strength. Grand maesters and healers from across the sea were summoned, each claiming some potion or remedy that might restore him. But time, that great equalizer, could not be bribed forever. For days, the king lay in his bedchamber, drifting between delirium and fleeting lucidity. Lionel and a few trusted members of the small council stood vigil. In a rare soft moment, Joffrey clasped his son's hand, murmuring advice on how to rule without mercy when needed, but also how to read the hearts of men when forging alliances. No one could say for sure if any trace of remorse for old cruelties flickered in his eyes, or if he felt only the unrelenting drive that had sustained him all his life. He died on a stormy night, thunder rattling the windows of the Red Keep. The bells tolled at dawn, and across the Seven Kingdoms, courtiers and commoners alike stirred to the news. In the north, some drank to celebrate, recalling ancient grudges. In the south, others shed tears, for they had known peace under his iron grip, even if it was bought with fear. Among the younger generation, confusion reigned, for they had rarely known another monarch. The funeral was as grand as any in living memory. His body was laid out in the great September of Baelor, clad in gilded armor and crowned with a stag and lion circlet. Torches burned, and 1,000 candles flickered in the hushed gloom where lords and ladies came to pay respects. Some came for politics, others out of genuine sorrow or curiosity. In the end, the man who had once been dismissed as a vicious boy tyrant left behind a realm that, in its own battered way, stood more unified than it had been in generations. For better or worse, his was a reign that molded Westeros through the forging fires of cruelty and calculation, softened only by fleeting acts of mercy. In song and story, Joffrey Baratheon would become an enigma, the scowling youth who once terrorized the royal court and the aging king who built roads, expanded fleets, and maintained a half-century of stability. Beneath the cynicism of the disenchanted and the adulation of the loyal, there rested a singular, irrevocable truth. For 50 years, the Seven Kingdoms had known no other ruler on the Iron Throne. A child's thirst for dominance had ripened into a monolith of authority, and in that span, House Baratheon and House Lannister, by extension, secured a legacy carved into the marrow of Westeros. No rebellion had successfully unseated him, no foreign army had conquered his shores, and no plot had ended his life before its appointed time. And so, when the last candle was snuffed out and his golden crown passed to Prince Lionel, the watchers on the city walls must have wondered what the future held for the kingdom now that the force of nature called King Joffrey Baratheon was gone. In the days after his funeral, small folk and nobility alike drifted to the taverns, exchanging stories about the king who had ruled from adolescence to his final breath. Some recalled the horrors of his earliest years, recounting details of his sadism with hushed voices. Others remembered him as the sovereign who built better roads, increased trade, and permitted them a measure of prosperity unknown under previous reigns. Those in the far corners of the realm who had never laid eyes on King's Landing recognized his name as a distant presence, a balancing force of dread and order that had prevented any fresh conflagration. The monarchy he left behind had grown into a sprawling network of alliances, trade routes, and fear-laced loyalties, all resting upon the foundations he had solidified. His own personal ambitions, tempered by Marjorie's influence and Tywin's harsh lessons, had shaped a generation. As Prince Lionel prepared for his coronation, he found himself surveying the realm with a heavy weight on his shoulders. His father's shadow was immense, stretching across every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. One might hope that Lionel's gentler spirit could maintain the peace without the same edge of terror. Yet the old courtiers knew better. The system Joffrey had built thrived on both fear and stability. Whether Lionel could maintain it without his father's ruthless streak remained to be seen. No matter how he governed, the kingdom would forever remember that for a half-century, Joffrey Baratheon had knelt to no one, forging an iron rule that outlasted all the doomsayers who once believed the boy king would meet a swift and bloody end. In the north, though the Boltons held power, some said that the old gods of the weirwood trees stirred quietly, remembering the Stark line. In Dorne, bitter hearts still yearned for a day they could stand free of Lannister Baratheon might. In the Reach, the older nobles recalled their beloved Marjorie and wondered whether her bright legacy had truly softened the king or merely refined his cruelty. And in the capital itself, new arrivals from distant corners of Essos and beyond came to see the city that, under Joffrey's reign, had grown into a formidable hub of trade and commerce. Many sought to profit from the new age that Lionel would usher in. But for now, they honored the memory of the man who had made such ambitions possible. His statue would soon stand alongside those of his predecessors, and the stories, both praising and damning, would intertwine with the grand tapestries in the halls of the Red Keep. Those who knew the truth of Joffrey's early years could scarcely believe the boy, who once shot arrows at the defenseless, had managed to rule so long and shape the fate of so many. Yet time and power can warp even the most vicious impulses into something that can pass for justice, and in half a century, the child had become a monarch of undeniable consequence. The War of the Five Kings was little more than a bitter memory, overshadowed by decades of relative stability. The plagues, the riots, the rebellions. He had survived them all, forging roads, alliances, and reputations. If anyone had told him, in his cruelest adolescent moments, that he would be revered by some as a restorer of order, he would have mocked them. But a crown changes not only those who serve but those who wear it, and no one could wear it longer than Joffrey without learning a certain kind of wisdom. Thus ended the era of King Joffrey Baratheon. In death, as in life, he remained a contradiction, at once monstrous and strangely visionary. Whatever peace or prosperity the Seven Kingdoms had known during his 50-year reign, it had come at a cost paid in fear and occasionally in blood. But it was peace nonetheless, in a land long accustomed to war and ruin. His tomb in the Great September of Baelor, adorned with carvings of stags and lions, would be a sight of both reverence and quiet curses. In the annals of the Maesters, his name would be recorded with neither unbridled praise nor absolute condemnation, but with a grudging acknowledgement that few kings had ever ruled so powerfully for so long. And in the end, that was what Joffrey had wanted from the start: to be remembered, to be obeyed, and to stand apart from any who would dare challenge the right of a Baratheon and a Lannister to sit the Iron Throne.